You're scrolling online and you see it, a video of someone playing with a tiger cub, or maybe a tiny monkey in a little sweater, and you can't help but wonder, could I do that? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on that fantasy and dive into the fascinating and pretty complex world of exotic pets.
And hey, it's a cool thought, right? But what really separates a wild animal from a pet, well, it's got nothing to do with how you train it or how much you love it. The real answer is written deep inside their DNA, over thousands and thousands of years.
To really get why, we have to look past the behavior of just one animal and zoom way, way out to see a process that's been in motion for millennia. And that starts with taking apart the fantasy itself. So, let's start there, the wild pet fantasy. So what is the actual difference? Well, it all boils down to one critical scientific idea: domestication. It's this huge genetic wall that separates a wolf from your poodle, a wild cat from your tabby, and it's exactly where that wild pet fantasy starts to crumble.
And this is so important to get. Domestication is not something that happens to a single animal. You can't just bring a tiger into your house and, raise it to be domesticated. It's a process that fundamentally rewrites the genetics of an entire species, generation after generation.
Okay, so this right here, this is the absolute core of the whole thing. You can tame a single wild animal. You can train it not to be afraid of you. But that's just surface-level conditioning. Domestication, that's a permanent, genetic change that gets passed down. A tamed tiger's cubs are still born 100% wild. Period.
And if you look at this table, you can really see how specific these categories are. On one end, you have the wild wolf, totally shaped by nature. And on the other, a domesticated dog, totally shaped by us. Even a stray cat is fundamentally different from, say, a circus lion. One is a domestic animal that just doesn't have a home. The other is a wild animal stuck in a cage.
Now, here's where things get really wild. It turns out that when humans select for just one single trait, friendliness, a whole bunch of other physical changes just kind of come along for the ride. They call it domestication syndrome. It's like this genetic chain reaction that also gives you floppy ears, spotted coats, and shorter snouts.
And we know this isn't just a theory, thanks to a pretty incredible experiment. Scientists in Siberia took wild silver foxes and only bred the ones that were the least aggressive. And within just a handful of generations, they weren't just acting like dogs, they started to look like them, with floppy ears and piebald coats. It was proof you can't just tame a fox, you have to literally genetically re-engineer it to get a domestic animal.
Okay, so we've established this really clear biological line. But what happens when people just ignore it? Well, the consequences aren't just theoretical. They fuel a massive and often cruel global industry.
The scale here is just staggering. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. This isn't some niche hobby. We're talking about a massive industry. Between just 2016 and 2024, almost 250 million wild animals were imported into the United States alone.
And for the animals themselves, the reality is just tragic. A shockingly high number of them don't survive. Take reptiles. They're often sold as easy or low maintenance, but their needs for specific temperatures, humidity, and food are nearly impossible to meet in someone's living room. They are, as researchers say, just fundamentally unsuited to captivity.
And you have to understand, that high death rate in the home, that's not even the full picture. The suffering is built right into the supply chain. The methods for capture and transport can be so brutal that for every single animal that makes it to a pet store, dozens and dozens more have already died along the way.
So what happens to the ones that do survive the trade and the home? Well, when they escape, or let's be honest, are released, the ecological damage can be an absolute catastrophe. Just look at Florida. It's become ground zero for invasive species, where a crazy 85% of all non-native reptiles and amphibians got their start in the pet trade. We're talking about Burmese pythons that have completely wiped out local wildlife.
Now, you might think this is just a problem for the animals and ecosystems, but this actually comes right back to us. Ignoring that wild-to-domestic divide creates a direct and often invisible threat to our own health.
You see, bringing a wild animal into our home creates this perfect bridge for diseases to cross over to humans. It's called zoonotic spillover, and it's a real risk. Reptiles are famous for carrying salmonella. Macaques can carry the often fatal B virus, and different rodents and primates have been directly linked to monkeypox outbreaks.
In fact, the risk is so real that the CDC has put out official warnings. They explicitly recommend that the most vulnerable people, little kids, the elderly, anyone with a compromised immune system, should just avoid these animals completely. You don't even have to touch a pet turtle to get sick. Salmonella can spread just from contact with its tank water.
Okay, so you've got the health risks, but what about the cost? We are not talking about a bag of kibble here. When you budget for a dog, you think about food and toys. The cost of a proper, secure habitat for a big cat can easily run you over $10,000, and that's before you try to find and pay for a vet who actually knows how to treat a tiger.
So, with all of this on the table, what's the solution? Well, as you can probably guess, it's a huge debate, with two very different ways of thinking about it.
So you've kind of got two main camps here. On one side, you have keeper groups like USARK who say the problem isn't the animals, it's bad owners. They think the answer is better regulation, permit systems, and education. On the other side, you have animal welfare groups who argue that a wild animal can never, ever truly thrive in a captive setting, and the only real solution is to ban the trade altogether.
Now, one argument you hear a lot is that private ownership actually helps conservation. But when you look at the science, that idea pretty much falls apart. For starters, most big cats in private hands are genetic mutts, hybrids with unknown ancestry, which makes them completely useless for any real conservation breeding program. And here's the bottom line. These animals can almost never go back to the wild. They never learned how to hunt, how to find a mate, or how to avoid humans. The success rate for reintroducing captive carnivores is only about 33%. So instead of helping conservation, the demand for these pets often fuels the very poaching that's pushing them towards extinction in the first place.
So, really, it all boils down to this one question. That line between a wild animal and a domestic one was drawn by thousands of years of evolution. The choice we have now is whether to respect that line or try to erase it for our own fantasy. And the evidence seems pretty clear that when we do that, it's the animals that always pay.